So our next talk comes from Eylul, and she's going to talk about the advocacy, and the FLOSS.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eylul Dogruel, and I am a contemporary artist and educator, part-time lecturer at Istanbul Technical University, and I'm also a volunteer for the Ubuntu studio. So, what exactly do I do as an artist? In my case, my artistic practice, I work with a variety of media. So I work with photography. It's one of my oldest mediums. I do both like more classic landscape photography and more, also some stuff that is more experimental. I also work with photography in a way that like using it to kind of lean toward video, making art, video art to be specific, which is a bit different than film in that it tends to be small and more photography, like more static like. I also work with creative coding. So I've done electronic art pieces that has been exhibited in various events internationally. This was a recent case of that was exhibited in Macedonia. And this was actually, I also do occasionally small installation-like work, which is from, this is actually called Solar Plant. It was on the previous Istanbul Biennale parallel event, and this is a commentary on greenwashing, which at the time wasn't discussed as much. I also work with traditional media, and primarily paper and markers, paper and pens, watercolor more recently, and occasionally acrylic. So you might wonder what is going on here. There's so much stuff happening, and my main practice is about mediums and how do you go from stylistic element of one medium and translate that to another. So how can you make, for example, electronic art, a code, look like a painting? But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I am an artist who uses free and lib open source software. So I use, when I'm working on my own work, I am using open source software more or less exclusively. Why is the question I get from my students and people who meet me often. Why would you be using open source software rather than the industry standard commercial software? Is it because you worry about freedom? Is it because it's good for you? This is the screenshot of a digital work that I have exhibited in Vancouver Art Gallery as part of the International Symposium of Electronic Arts. This was in 2015. And the color that is missing in this spectrum is the exact tone of the color that Yves Klein has kind of copyrighted. And this was a commentary on copyright and how copyright is an error we need to root around. So I do care about copyright issues, I do care about open source, I do care about freedom of information. I do think that this is important, but this is not why I started using open source software. Then why? This was a game. It was called Spookargram. It was basically a 10-gram game that where, you know, the board was hunted and it will be moving around. It's a silly thing that I did for a university. This was a game. This is the only thing that remains of it. Because the software I made the game in, Macromedia Director, no longer exists. It was bought over by another company, and then it was discontinued. So I have no access to the source, and most of the plugins and such that view this work does not exist anymore. This is another school university era work. This is called Wall. It was an interactive art that was intended to describe what depression looks like, what mental illness looks like. And this was done in Flash. It is in my to-do list. I have the assets of it. I have the images that made this thing, but the work does not work anymore because Flash does not exist anymore. This one was not interactive. This was also done in Flash, the girl with flying hair from 2011. And this one kind of exists because I managed to screen record it. It's not the quality it was, but I managed to somehow rescue a version of this work as a GIF. But the original, the full quality work, no longer exists. So one of the primary reasons that made me go, no, I'm just going with open source, was the lack of open document formats. For an artist, the fact that you retain your original work and your documentation is extremely critical to your work, and to be able to have that whole item, to be able to show it, to be able to talk about it. Yet, anytime that I use a commercial software, it vanished. So I decided to not use them anymore. Or anything that is closed-sourced, they vanished, to be more specific. Also, another problem I ran into was need to use the software outside the prescribed workflows. It is interesting, it's easy to think, oh, I'm just going to stay in this ecosystem. But the fact that I can take a work that I sketch in my paint and move it to Krita for more detailed work, and then do a post-processing on it on Darktable, one of these software is not even intended for illustration, yet I can use it for illustration. And the fact that the files can move from one software to another is a huge advantage. As a matter of fact, part of this is why I end up using Ubuntu Studio. I was trying to record my own sound in a different operating system. It didn't work because it was preventing the computer audio to be played and then recorded with added stuff on top. What I was doing was perfectly legal, but it was blocked by security pieces that was put to prevent me from, that was put in place to prevent breach of copyright. I wasn't doing anything like that, but I was stopped from being able to do the work I was intending to do. Then I installed Ubuntu Studio. Then what happened is that I stopped playing games for 2 years because I liked the user interface so much that I did not want to switch back. Which brings me to my third comment. It just works. Yes, it might be difficult to install it because of the way that the hardware doesn't come with the software these days. But once you get it to working, I find a lot more flexible in doing what you need to do, and it is a lot more resilient. And by this, I do not mean the command line, because this is the argument I always hear, oh, the command line is great. I use the command line. I love the command line. But it goes beyond that. The software is literally designed to make life easier for a user rather than making them sell, like, it's not optimized for making the user spend more money. It is optimized to making the user's life easier. But what does it mean to be an artist that uses free open source software? I mean, there are the usual suspects. I use Darktable, I use GIMP, I use Krita. Hugin is a panorama software that I use both for panoramas and for stitching. I have a lot of traditional works that are larger, and the way that you would document that work is that you would take multiple pictures so that you have enough resolution. Then you can stitch it on a panorama software to get a very flat and high resolution image of the work. I use Hugin more these days for this task than I do for panorama making. I use Inkscape when I need to make vectors that can change colors for my website. That can also be used for illustration. That's just how I use it. I use my Paint for sketching. It's very lightweight. It's great. I use processing.org. For those who doesn't know, that's a Java-based programming language designed for designers and artists. That makes it very easy to make creative code work. I use Cyril occasionally. I don't do so much deep space photography, but once or twice I actually needed that, that capability of the specific software. But this is not just what it takes to be an open source software using artist. It also means that my operating system is open source. I use Ubuntu Studio. I use Scribus to make my portfolios that I submit to projects and such. I use Open Camera to take my photographs. Not exclusively, but often I do. There's a couple other software on Android that I do use for that. I use OBS if I need to live stream my process. I use, or just sometimes if I'm giving a remote talk, it makes my life a lot easier to be able to show my work and myself and all of those complicated stuff. I use libvacom. That's how I make sure that my graphic tablet can connect and work with my computer. All of these are open source software. But it goes beyond that. I use Calibre to make EPUB books that are like, you know, my own work or whatever reason. I do sometimes need to create EPUBs, and that's where I use it. I use Clementine to listen to music while I'm working. I use Firefox where, you know, we need a browser. I use LibreOffice when I'm filling out the, my forms that when I'm applying to an residency or an exhibition. You need to write things, whether that's information about your artwork, material. In general, I'm teaching, I use it there. I use Ocular. Again, obviously, I do need to be able to access and read PDFs and or present slides as it is now. I use VLC to be able to convert media between different formats. So for example, I have format being my creative code work being outputted in a certain format from processing. I need to make it to what the exhibiting side, the gallery or the event requires. That's where I do that. Or I just use FFmpeg these days, but you know, both of them works. I use Zimwikis. It's for note-taking, keeping documentation of my work, keeping documentation on my teaching, all of those things. All of these items are open source software. But there is more. I use Unihost and Mastodon and PixelFed as my main social media. Yes, I am self-hosted. And yes, thanks to Unihost, it actually doesn't require me to do too much maintenance. It is actually manageable. I just press the buttons to update things. Sometimes things break spectacularly, but overall, it actually works. Anyone who follows me on Mastodon, this is the setup I have. And I'm not a system admin by trade, just to clarify. So all of these things are part of my workflow. And the fact that all of these things can interact with each other and doesn't hinder each other, that's not trying to monetize me as data, helps me make my work better and makes my workflow a lot easier. So about a decade ago, I went from being just an artist, a user of open source software, to being a volunteer for it. It's the usual story. I was using Ubuntu Studio. There was a declaration, oh, we need beta testers. I use the software, I should give back, right? Right? Yeah, I figured I will just be beta testing and, you know, maybe beta testing again on the next release. Famous last words. A few years later, I've been working as a volunteer. Mastodon happened in the first round in 2017, Fediverse. And I made a mistake. At this point, I'm using open source software as my workflow pretty exclusively. And I just made the mistake of saying, hey, I have this tag called art with open source. This is not just for me. You should use that too. I mean, this was Mastodon. It was very small back then, and despite in that scale, kind of went a little bit viral. And as a result, I had a bit of a megaphone on my hand for next few months of being able to say, hey, here's why you should use open source for art. Here's how you can use open source for art. And that was the beginning of a journey. I had the edit backlog tag where I was just posting photographs that I was editing using open source software. The goal was to not tell you should be using it. It was to showcase what you can do with it. Year 2018. And all of these is still happening. And independently, I ended up being offered a position to part-time teach it as a lecturer at Istanbul Technical University. They needed photography, so I'm teaching photography, and I'm like really trying to think, okay, I'm using open source software, this is photography, how do I make sure that my students have the right skills to be able to transition from software to software? Will I be able to do this properly? I'm from a fine arts background of photography, usual suspects of being the imposter syndrome. I think it was 2 weeks before the class started that I realized, wait a second, I've been always telling we should teach art with open source software to be able to, get students to learn using it and to make it be the industry standard. 2 weeks before the class, I realized, wait, I'm actually going to be doing this. Those two things did not actually even connect together until that point that, wait, I actually get to do this. So what did my class look like when I started to teach photography with open source software? It was Darktable, GIMP, Hugin, processing, with the exception of processing, usual suspects. Photography basics, again, introduction to photography class, obviously. Creative coding, this was something that the department also agreed, like that I will be adding some creative coding because that's also something I do, and this is something that's interesting to students. And I had this idea that I want to teach free and open source software beyond just the software. So getting a little bit into the culture of it. This is what the class looked like in 2018. This is what it looks like now. So what exactly changed? Still the same software, still the same content, but what I realized somewhere in the way was that the goal of teaching the code, yes, it was to give them, to enable them to be able to write the tools if they need it or modify them, but it goes beyond that. As artists, it's really critical for us to understand the process we put our work through. Sometimes the process is as important as the end result. And I think that was what was missing to me about why it was so important to be using open source software in art. So the way I teach my class these days is we are learning focus, so camera focus. We discuss how you can have shallow depth of field on a larger aperture, yes. We talk about why an image is out of focus. We discuss how you emulate that in the code, which is blur, and then we show that in the software, and then we show that how to use that critically. We learn what a histogram is and how to generally code it, but then we learn how to use that as a tool to take well-exposed images. So what I am trying to do, I found, is that I am trying to demystify the tools and dissociate tools from being an immutable end product into something that you can use and modify in a more intuitive way. And most importantly, understand exactly what it does. I make sure that my students understand when they make an edit or take a picture on a camera, they understand exactly what they are doing. We are also discussing a lot about how photograph is a created image and not taken. This is something that I drill into my students' heads, which is very important to understand whenever you are looking to an image, whether that's a news photograph or an artistic photograph or a portrait, it always has a goal, it always has something to tell you. And I want them to understand And also, and how this actually ties down to the idea of you owning tools, you modifying the tools, because if you cannot, if your tool dictates what you do, your artistic style is dictated by that. Almost like what you tell through that is dictated by that or is limited by that. By teaching them about learning how to make their own tools, modifying their tools, and the idea that tools are mutable, that they are modifiable, they are learning that the process is modifiable and that they have the power to create their own styles rather than what is dictated by what is out there as existing items. And this is kind of where we tie to the parallels between artistic process and free and open source software philosophy, and that is kind of where I realized this is why I really felt the need to swap to open source software. Checking the time. And then this, in the last year, brought me full force back into the advocacy and a desire to bring this idea to more artists, and how can we do this? So what is the problem? Why is more artists not wanting to use open source software? There are multiple issues, obviously. The first is what we call the adoption and resource problem cycle. One obvious problem that all of us know really, is the availability problem. And yes, we can install Linux on a laptop, but you have to ask the question. Aral Balkan has this word. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but he said this: if you have, does a top surgeon have time to do this? It is not that if they can, in theory, with infinite amount of energy and time, do they have the time to do this? Do they have time to achieve this? And this is very important. Right now, we expect the users to be able to do the work to make something work. We expect them to have the time to learn to do that thing to make it work. And then we expect them to have the time to notice that there is an option like this. And that is what we need to fix. And that is where how we are going to go forward. By availability, I mean obviously things working out of the box and documentation being available, but I also mean, is this available pre-installed? Is this available pre-installed geographically, not just in Europe and US, but is it available beyond that? Is this available pre-installed on the local shop or the local online shop? I don't mean international Amazon, but I mean local online shop, so that somebody whose computer broke down can immediately go and buy that replacement. And that is where we lose people. Beyond that, mobile becomes more and more critical for artists' workflow. If you are a traveling photographer, if you are doing a performance art, you might not have always the large laptop with you. The fact that we are present there is critical. But a lot of these problems, yeah, I'm talking about the problems here, but also there is an adoption problem that goes beyond the availability issue. We still should have more availability. Sorry, word. English is hard. The other problem is visibility. Open source software is for tech people. Open source software is hard. It is command line. It is flexible, but it is the thing that geeks do. It is not something that the artists use. It is not something that people on a deadline use. Really? No, it really isn't. And no, I know that everyone here knows that, but that is the view that outside has, and we need to fix this. To do that, first of all, we need to convince ourselves. Because I think somewhere in the way, we even convince ourselves that open source software is only for geeks, for makers. We convince ourselves that ordinary people, they won't adopt it anyway. We need to stop thinking that, because there is a very real benefit to adopting open source software rather than closed-sourced alternatives that is for users, that is even beyond privacy and resilience, and it's all of these things. And how can we achieve this? And this is where the crux of this talk comes in. Artists are ambassadors. What we do as we entertain, we reach out to people. We are good at showing what something can do, how something can be amazing. Accept us our help in doing that. It is important that we reach out beyond tech and maker circles. Let's not just go to computer science departments. Let's go to art departments, to econ departments, and talk to them about why the software can help their workflow, how it can make it better, because it can. Equalizing the playing field. Yes, marketing is important, and this is something I'm going to go back and say. Let us be the influencers. I am sorry, I know this is an ugly word. When a commercial software shows up, for example, Adobe's new animation software showed up, what they did was they invited artists who were on YouTube, very visible artists with good followers, and asked them to test the software, to try it out. What do you think that did? These people went on and proceeded to use this, and then it meant other people saw it being used and how it could be used, and it allowed the software to be more commonly adopted. We cannot do this. We can do this. Even beyond advertising, we need to level the playing field. Closed source software's business model is getting the user to pay as much as possible and adoption, and they have uneven advantage due to the resources that they have. By definition, we have less resources because we are not willing to exploit the users. It's important that we do really push toward legislations that will support open source software, that will support users' rights. And I don't mean just, there has been a good habit of governments, for example, adopting FLOSS. That's great. But can't we go beyond that? Right to repair. This matters to us. The fact that products, hardware is not locked in services, but actually mutable tools, that they are objects that we own and can modify, is critically important to open source, yes. It is also important for the environment. Can't we collaborate with existing efforts to make right to repair and lessening of the trash we create, electronic trash? Can't we join to those things? Can't we join to those movements, add our own point of view to that? Can't we talk about how open source software is an alternative to, for example, the additional cost that the companies have? How open source software can be a way to standardize, to make sure that electronic items can last longer and can be used more, and that can be repurposed. This is one thing. The second one, universal basic income. Again, you might think, wait, why? What does this have to do with open source software? But imagine a world where people have the time to work on the projects that they do without having to monetize it or find a job that will help them, eat still. Imagine a world where they won't have to spend time monetizing it. They won't have to spend time writing Patreon posts or Kickstarter projects, try to figure out how to do funding and all of the legal stuff, because they have the money they need. And they can just focus on doing what they love, which is building software. Imagine a world where influencers who love doing what they are doing can choose the software and issues that they actually do care about, and can spend their time highlighting those rather than having to find sponsorships and say what they want. And before I finish this, I just want to tell one last thing. What can we do as an artist? As artists, we are different than academics in that academics will go deep and narrow into one topic. Engineering is a bit like that too. We specialize less. We still have our own specializations, but we specialize less. And our strength is to find connections between distinct things that might not be as visible. Use us that way. How, you ask? Have artists in your team. This is what I was in Ubuntu Studio for the longest time. It took me a better part of the decade to clarify that. I am the art lead, yes, because I do the wallpapers and I help out with graphics. But what I am also is the artist in residence. I am the person who sees the workflows. I am the person who also tries to create art using this thing while collaborating with the developers. Can't we formalize this beyond that? If you're a small project, if you're a large project, have an artist residency, have a regular artist residency. It doesn't need to be that they are doing something directly related to what you are doing. At best, it is nice marketing, something for you to show that is interesting. It's even better, it actually allows you to have meaningful collaboration and will allow you to come up with more ideas. It will also bring opportunities to artists to do work with a company that they actually want to support. If you're a small project with not a lot of funds, still have an artist residency, have a remote artist residency. Yes, it's better to pay the artists, but realize that there's also a lot of us who are willing to donate our time or is also interested in the opportunity to have a collaboration like that. It enriches us too, to be able to talk to engineers, to people with fields outside of ours. So use that resource. And if you're an artist, reach out to your local open source software community. You might be surprised, as I did, that they are much more open to dialogue than you would imagine. Thank you.
Testing, testing. All right. Thank you. You had a slide and discussion about the ability for an artist to modify the tools they use to further their ability to express themselves in ways the tools don't automatically allow. I think this is really powerful and an inherent advantage to open source software versus commercial software. I think there's a problem though in that it requires a lot of technical ability often to understand the underlying software to know how to modify a tool to do something else. And I wonder, I don't know much about art software, I'm not an artist, but are you aware of any particular software that allows this kind of ability to modify the software in intuitive ways that users would find, I mean, without requiring coding skills, that you can kind of modify the software in ways that weren't intended?
For example, 2 examples I can give is sometimes it is not about so much modifying the software specifically, but that you can literally use the software together in a way that is completely unexpected. Like the fact that I am using Hugin to make prints of my artwork. Hugin is a panorama software. It is intended for photography. It is not intended for art, yet it works fantastically. Another way is the way that I'm using Ubuntu Studio, for example, I was using it literally, the jack itself, to record music using simple tools. It is also about not using the tools in unexpected ways. It is also, it is even just a concept that these tools are, once we start understanding what a blur code does, what a blur is, and what, when you do a tone curve change, what it does to the photograph. Sometimes it is not about being able to edit that complete software, which is complicated, but it is the ability to be able to write your own code a little bit that does it, or at least find a way creatively to do what you want to do, whether that is in software scripting, or it is combining two things unexpected, or using a software that is completely for a different field that you can just adapt to what you need. It's more about understanding what that processes do and being in the control of them. Necessarily, if you cannot code, maybe you'll use 10 different software to do what you want it to do. That is still modifying your tools. Or maybe you are going to do part of it by hand, and then you are going to draw something by hand that you specifically scan. Or maybe you are going to modify your scanner to do something else. I mean, sometimes by just using a different color light maybe on it, or using a different object. I don't mean technical modifications. There is still a lot you can do creatively without necessarily having to completely, for example, go into Krita and modify the software itself. It's more being able to play with your tools and get them to do what you want. And I will say this much, open source software generally, by default, gives you more options to do things differently than commercial software that is really honed into making you work in one workflow. Like one thing I noticed in Darktable, for example, the color mixing, the channel mixer is actually allowing you to swap channels, which is extremely important if you are doing infrared photography. Versus poor closed source alternative users have to do some sort of bizarre scripting to be able to even get that done. So there are those advantages as well. The fact that you can bug report and contribute to your software in a different way so that those changes happen, that's another part of it. That you can collaborate with the open source software developers to get something happening, that's another aspect of it. So when I'm talking about the tool, modifying tools, I don't mean just, that's what I was thinking it was when I was teaching the class in 2018. And that was the realization I had as time went on. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not. Okay.
Hello. Yeah, it's very nice that you're teaching your students to use open source software. My question is, what they do when your course is finished? They keep using open source software, or they switch back to commercial ones?
When I was teaching it as an optional, like I am teaching using open source software and they are allowed to use whatever they want, it was 50-50. These days, I require them to use the open source software in the assignments, which are 1 week turnaround. On the final project, they are welcome to use anything they want. And the end result I've seen is that most of them, by that time, are willing to use what we've learned the class in. And it depends. Some people will try to bounce back, and some people will do both. Like, I've definitely seen them also combine one open source and one commercial software, etc. But generally, I will say adoption is not bad. But I don't know what happens after the class. No worries.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for certainly giving me advice over the past almost 5 years, and being my artist in residency, and being the art lead for Ubuntu Studio. But my question is for those groups that don't have an artist in residency to be able to give such advice as far as artwork and whatnot, where would they go about finding such an artist in residency?
Go to the art departments, university art departments. You'll find a lot of young students who are trying to gain experience, who would also benefit from that. go to art forums. That's a good place to go to. It's not just like, don't just rely on people who does find your forums. Don't just rely on people who finds IRC. Go to, whether that's DeviantArt or ArtStation, these websites, and see what type of artists are there. Granted, these are more commercial artists, so they might have less time, but at the same time, put out announcements on art websites and see if anybody is interested. Also go into the crossover areas. For example, Krita has a forum named Krita Artists that does attract quite a bit of illustrators. Pixels Us has photographers who use open source software already. If you feel less confident, those might be also the avenues. But I will say definitely reach out beyond, go to areas where conferences where or institutes that does electronic art. You'll find very tech-savvy artists there. That's the solution. But as I said, even beyond that, just reach out to your local university's art department. Nothing might come out, but you might be surprised.
So thank you for the talk. It's really inspiring. A lot of the free software art tools are sometimes difficult to install on Windows. At least that was my experience. It was really awkward to install them sometimes. Do you think the existence of Windows Subsystem for Linux, specifically the part that you can just run graphical applications easily, would be a useful tool for graphical artists to just keep using what they have in their laptop, because they're not like technical people who are comfortable just reinstalling the operating system, but still have access to the vast library of software available in Ubuntu and Debian?
Can you repeat what you said a little bit slower and a little closer
Sure.
to the microphone? Sorry.
Do you think using WSL2 and the graphical application support could be seen as a useful tool to allow artists who have Windows laptops but still have access to the vast majority of software available in Ubuntu and in Debian easily without having to switch to another operating system, which they might find challenging?
If I understood your question, you were asking me if the fact that availability of the software, the commercial software, is a barrier to entry. Is that
Using like a Windows laptop, but using Ubuntu through WSL2 that supports graphical applications. So when, for instance, you want to install GIMP, well, GIMP is really high profile, so it has a Windows installer. But there's a lot of software that just works really well on Linux, but it's difficult to put on a Windows machine. But with WSL2, you can actually just install it and run it alongside everything else you already have and know.
that is actually what brought a lot of people to Ubuntu Studio, that, for example, audio software is really, really hard to set up and is not available on Windows. That is definitely an audience we had. I'm switching hats to Ubuntu Studio volunteer here for a moment. But yeah, that's definitely an advantage. And but that shouldn't keep people from making their software available to other platforms, obviously. But also realize that what will help and retain artists is having the smaller utilities. So for example, the fact that Plasma has a graphic tablet utility that at some point apparently was working better than the original drivers. Not entirely sure how that happened, not sure if that is still the case. That was a huge advantage, and that was something we could market. And there are a few things missing, like color calibration, etc., that would really help retain artists. Right now, the peripheral support, like screen support, color calibration, these are some of the bottlenecks that will even help make artists actually prefer Linux over Windows. Right now, a lot of the artists tend to use Macs, not even Windows. So that will be an advantage because we will have the flexibility and those missing tools. But at the same time, yeah, like having tools available that is not available on Windows, that definitely does bring people in. Not so much on the visual art, but definitely on the audio side and video side. I know that people do move to Linux side because there are options available. That is pre-calibrated, pre-installed, because installation of these things and setting up these things are not trivial either.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your talk. You started by mentioning copyright and Yves Klein's blue, maybe Anish Kapoor and his special black is an even more eyebrow-raising example. But you ended by talking about the need for artists to be able to make a living, be able to do things like eat and have shelter, which is extraordinary of them to want that. In a world where everybody seems to think that all artistic output should be free and shareable, and copyright has protected artists' incomes for a long time. How would you like us to think about copyright in relation to the tools and the artwork?
Oh. Okay, I'm going to try to keep this brief because this is a different talk that I could also give at this point, as it is actually one of my primary interests. Copyright is a compromise. It is a compromise that was created so that people could come up with new ideas. New idea generation is, warning, I am not an economist, I'm just daughters of two, all mistakes belong to me, before I say this. But generally, the idea creation can be considered in some way a positive externality. An action that is profitable to everyone, to the commons, but that profit doesn't necessarily look visible to the extent to the individual who does it. So you lack incentive. And what copyright does is that it tries to create a monopoly, a temporary monopoly, to fix that, to encourage that positive externality for everyone. That's what it was intended to be. These days, it is not what it is anymore. And there is also a question that we need to ask, if, we are living in more and more in an environment that is where ideas are not generated by individuals, but more by communities due to the increase in communication. And there is a question, increasingly so, of who does this idea belong to, because it actually belongs to a dialogue. Nobody creates an idea on their own. Ideas are created within dialogues. And yet one person who comes with it is given the ownership to fix this problem of making, it's an imperfect solution to maintain idea generation at its heart. With something like universal basic income, why do I say that open source should be supporting that? It is an alternative. Because you fix the problem that artists and inventors need to eat, and decouple that from the idea generation, the ideas can be commons. You mentioned Anish Kapoor. Actually, that work was before that. And it was the same year Nina Pillay also had a TED talk where she said that copyright is brain damage. Because what's happening is that you are stopping the communication of something, information. And you are removing information away from the, how do I put this? You take the information away from the process of dialogue that allows it to be modified and turn it into an immutable object. Information is not an immutable object. Information is something that flows, and this is where you run into this problem. So that is why copyright is an error you need to root around. This is why it is a temporary solution, imperfect solution. Creative Commons partially fixes that problem, not completely. Okay, that was a very long explanation, but sorry.
Hello, thanks for your talk. My question's really about user interface design. And I imagine artists, especially of the kind of art that you seem to do, you want as least resistance as possible between your ideas and manipulating them or creating them with a piece of software. Do you think we could do more, or we could do a better job of reducing the complexity of the software that you're using to help people like you make creation more easy? I mean, some of the software that you listed is fantastic, Darktable, Krita, but they are also very complicated, and there's a steep learning curve that maybe gets in the way of people being creative. Do you think we could do a better job with that?
We need different tools with different jobs. So Krita actually has been doing an amazing job reaching out to artists and making the software work for an artist, which is why it has such a huge adoption at this point. Some other software has more challenges, and yes, obviously we can do better interfaces. But honestly, where I'm noticing the biggest problems, bottlenecks at the moment for an artist is more on the operating system side, especially drivers, support of the peripherals, and availability of specialized products. So for example, we love to have our drawing tablets, whether that is iPad style or more laptop style with a slate laptops. We do not have, for example, in a Linux, like pure Linux, I don't mean Android, pure Linux version product that allows us to do that. We also are lacking in the mobile interfaces, and I think that is somewhere where the resources are just not enough. Like, Krita is amazing, but it's not available for mobile. The interface is not just the fact that it's not packaged. A lot of the photography software, same problem, while more and more photographers' workflows involves just editing on the phone and just posting right there. So that is kind of, we are falling behind on adopting new hardware and adapting our software to the new hardware rather than desktop accessibility. It's the peripherals and the specialized devices that where we are, I feel like, losing the adoption a lot.